Welcome back to the CHIA training. We're about to start section 2, and that's titled Hotel Math Fundamentals, the metrics used by the hotel industry. In the old days, we used to call this hotel math for dummies, but it seemed like people were offended by that a little bit potentially, so we changed the name. But critical stuff, and this is a real good chapter. Look at the subsections. Again, section 2 has 4 subsections, and it's related to the types of data. First, we start with property level data, then we cover comp set data, and then at the end, a little bit about industry data, and then subsection 4 is international issues. So this is how this second section is organized into 4 subsections. First, let's start with property level data. And we'll start with the raw data. STR obtains most of its data via exports from the hotel companies. Now, if it's an independent hotel, we do have a web user interface, and an independent hotel can go and enter data for just their hotel. And that, some of the data comes in that way, but most of it, 95% of the data we get from an export from the corporate headquarters. So we're getting data from Hilton in Northern Virginia, and from Marriott and Bethesda, and from all the corporate headquarters, and that comes directly into STR. And that's good, because not individual hotels entering that data. It's the same data coming from their PMS systems in the hotels back to their corporate headquarters and then to STR. Once we get that data, STR performs a huge number of error checks, very comprehensive, checking everything you can imagine related to that data. Any data, if there's any question at all, that goes back to corporate headquarters. We require them to double check that and ensure that it's accurate before it gets loaded into the system. Now, we'll talk about the raw data in a minute. The definitions used for raw data are based upon something called the Uniform Systems of Account for the Lodging Industry. That's abbreviated USALI, and you can get one of these from HFTP. That's an association. You can look them up and you can purchase one of those. Very large, comprehensive book, very thorough definitions for each of the terms that I'm going to show you here. STR receives 3 fields of data for each hotel. And we do get these for monthly and then separately for daily. So STR gets 2 types of data from hotels. We get monthly data and then we get daily data. And we do ask for both as well. So look at the definitions. The first definition is supply. Now, supply means the rooms available. These are the rooms in the hotel multiplied by the days in whatever time period you're talking about. So supply means rooms available. Second, demand means the actual rooms they sold. It's the number of rooms sold, does not include complimentary rooms. It does not include no-shows. Now, all those little fine definitions are in that book. And honestly, that book takes about 50 pages to define each of these terms. So I joke with people, if you have trouble sleeping at night, that's a great read for you. But we keep these definitions super simple. So that's demand, the room sold. Third raw data field is room revenue. That is the revenue generated from the sale of rooms. Now, it does not include taxes. It does not include F&B, food and beverage. It doesn't include spa, all those other types of revenue. It includes something called service charge, but it does not include the resort fee. That's a fine point that we mention as well. And those are the raw data fields. This is just a quick slide. Again, the accuracy of the data, the confidentiality, that's all critical stuff. Those are STR top priorities, just to remind you, security and confidentiality. Okay, next, key performance indicators for the hotel industry. The hotel industry uses 3 main key performance indicators. We call these KPIs. And here are the formulas and a little information about each one. The first one is occupancy. Now, occupancy is simply the demand divided by the supply. In other words, the rooms sold divided by the rooms available. And generally that's the small number divided by the big number. It is a percentage, so we multiply it times 100 and we display that as a percentage. So that's occupancy. Next KPI, average daily rate, nicknamed ADR. That is the revenue number divided by the demand. In other words, the room revenue divided by the rooms sold. It, of course, is displayed as a currency value. So, and that'll depend upon the country you're in. Third KPI is something called revenue per available room. Hotel industry professionals nickname this the RevPAR. It is the revenue divided by the supply, the rooms available. Now note the difference. ADR is revenue divided by demand, where RevPAR is revenue divided by supply. It is displayed as a currency value, just like the ADR. This is an important metric for hotel industry professionals because it's sort of a measurement of success. It's a, you think of it as sort of a combination of occupancy and average daily rate. And if you think about it, if you ran a hotel and your only goal was a high occupancy, what would you do? Well, you'd lower the ADR so low that, you filled up your hotel. Not a good business decision. The RevPAR would emphasize that. If your only goal was a high ADR, you might raise it really high, and maybe somebody would think, somebody might make a reservation, somehow think that your hotel was, incredibly worth staying there, and maybe you get a very high ADR, but only one person stayed. So your occupancy would be low. There again, the RevPAR would show whether you're really doing good business. Frequently, RevPAR is involved when you're talking about the bonus for the general manager. That's what they're looking at. So here are a couple graphics when it comes to the KPIs. Let's look at this one first. On the left-hand side, you see the raw data field. Supply, again, room nights available. Demand, room nights sold. Revenue, room revenue. Now think of it from supply and demand divided by supply, room nights sold divided by room nights available. What does that give you? In the middle column, occupancy, the percent of the rooms occupied. Down below that, ADR, average daily rate, is what? The room revenue divided by the room nights sold. And don't forget the third KPI, the RevPAR, is what? It's the room revenue divided by the total room nights available. So 3 KPIs are generated from 3 raw data fields. As the notes say, RevPAR is widely viewed as a gold standard metric for measuring performance. Can be thought of as sort of a combination of occupancy and ADR. So here we have it in building block format. One more time. Supply, raw data. Demand, raw data. Revenue, raw data. Upon that raw data, 3 KPIs, the occupancy, demand divided by supply, the ADR, revenue divided by demand, and then RevPAR, revenue divided by supply. And that's how it all fits together. Let's do an example here. Now, this example is, we start with a supply, and hypothetically, for this time period, whatever it is, we have 150 room nights available. Demand, hypothetically, in this situation, whatever the time period is, our hotel sold 75 rooms, 75 out of 100. And our hotel collected $7,500 in room revenue. So let's begin to do the math. First, occupancy. What would that be? That'd be 75 divided by 150. What's our occupancy? 50%. Next up, ADR. What would that be? That'd be the revenue, 7,500, divided by the demand, 75. What's our ADR? $100. And finally, RevPAR. Keep in mind, that would be the 7,500 divided by the 150. And that gives us a $50 RevPAR. We have a little exercise in here practicing with the KPIs. At this point in time, typically what we do in a workshop, or what we suggest a professor do in class, is have students bring out their calculator and actually do the math. And you go through here. This is built into the PowerPoint. Feel free to practice with this on your own. For occupancy for January, what would we do? We take 2345, type that in our calculator, divided by 3,100, and we get an occupancy of 75.6. Take time, actually do that. Make sure you got the math down. For the exam, you will need to remember these formulas, and you'll need to do this in the CHIA exam. Next up, room revenue, 198,765 divided by the demand 2345 is going to give you an ADR of 84.76. Practice, make sure you get that. And in the rest of the PowerPoint, there are other formulas. RevPAR is going to be the room revenue divided by the 3,100. And then down below, we get occupancy, ADR, RevPAR for February. And we want to make sure you can actually do the math behind here. You can use a calculator in the exam, and that will perfectly be okay. We do want you to remember the formulas. So right now we've got 3 formulas to remember: OCC, ADR, and RevPAR. Here's the 4th formula: percent change. And this is important. This is measuring the growth. And percent change compares whatever number you can have a lot of percent changes. It compares the number this year to the same number last year. In our first example, we referred to this as year-over-year change, and that is a common alternative for what we mean here. But it is important to understand it's the same time this year compared to the same time last year. We'll talk more about that in a minute. So the percent change measures the amount of growth or decline. Now, it could be positive, it could be higher this year, but it could be negative. It could be lower this year from the same period last year. The hotel industry uses percent change, not point change. We'll see that in the formula. So step 1, you find the difference, and then step 2, you divide by last year. Let's look at the formula below. It's a hard copy. It's in boldface. So percent change equals this year minus last year. Now, let's say it could be any metric. It could be occupancy. So it would be the occupancy this year minus the occupancy last year. Then what do? We divide it by the occupancy last year. So it's not just a point change. A point change would simply be this year minus last year. That's it. But we divide it back into the last year value. And because it is a percentage, we do multiply it times 100. Percent changes are very important. As we said, they show the growth. We calculate a percent change. They're showing improvement over time. Are we going up? Are we going down? And that's an important measurement of performance. And again, whether you're getting a bonus or not. Percent changes are calculated for the key performance indicators like occupancy, average daily rate, and RevPAR. We calculate a percent change for all 3. We also calculate percent change for rooms sold, rooms available, and room revenue. So we calculate them for all of them, and you'll see those in reports that we look at coming up. Very closely scrutinized. We want to know, are we growing? Is it positive or is it negative? So practicing with percent changes, and in this slide, we just have occupancy and ADR in here, and notice column B and column C have the occupancy and ADR for this year. Column D and E have the occupancy for last year. Let's do a few. 78.9 occupancy this year compared to 67.8. Now, how do we do this? If we're using a calculator, then it's very easy. Notice the formula has the parentheses in it. Now those parentheses are very important if you're putting a formula into Excel. Remember, the parentheses enforce the order of operations. And it says step 1, find the difference. This year minus last year. That's in the parentheses. Step 2, we divide it by last year. So the parentheses enforce the order of operations, and that's critical if you're putting that formula into Excel for some reason. Now, if you're just using your calculator, you're going to do that in a step 1, step 2 situation anyway. So that's very easy, and you won't necessarily need the parentheses. But let's go ahead and do that for the January occupancy. Step 1, 78.9 minus last year, 67.8. And then hit equal, and we get a difference of 11.1. That's the difference, but it's not the percent change. We then divide that into last year, 67.8, and we get a percent change of 16.37. We round that up to 16.4. That's our percent change. We do multiply that times 100 as well. Get the idea? Easy to do. We do ADR percent change. What would that be? 140.68 minus 123.56. Go ahead and calculate the difference. Then divide that into 123.56, and you're going to get a ADR percent change of 13.9. Now let's look at February occupancy. Little different scenario here. February occupancy. What do we have here? We have 54.3 this year minus last year 60.1. And when we do that, what do we have? We have negative 5.8. That is a negative number. Now, we then divide that into into 60.1, and then multiply that times 100, and we get negative 9.7. Important to see, percent changes can be positive or negative. Here's an example where the this year number was lower than the last year number, and of course that shows a decrease. Percent change went down. So as you go through here, try these different ones, the ADR percent change, and then we put those in for March as well. Test these, make sure you've got that formula. Remember, this year minus last year, and if you're using Excel, they've got to be in parens to enforce the order of operations. Do that first. Then divide by last year, then multiply the result times 100. That's the formula that we used. You see it right in the middle of this slide. This year minus last year divided by last year times 100. Good. Couple hints about percent changes. Occupancy is always related to supply and demand with percent changes. Remember, occupancy is demand divided by supply. So percent change, that's always important. If supply remains the same and demand goes up, occupancy will go down. If supply goes up and demand remains the same, occupancy will go down as well. So it's important to understand, the interaction between demand and supply. Best example of that is, if you look at a country like China, China has had a relatively good demand, but there are many times where occupancy is negative. Why is that? Because in China, there's a very high supply. So when it comes to percent changes, there is that interaction for you to understand. So the key is, if demand goes up higher than supply, occupancy will be positive. And that's the interaction. Next little hint, RevPAR percent change. Now here's a little hint to help you check your math. RevPAR percent change is roughly the combination of occupancy and ADR percent change. Now it's not exact, but it will be in the same neighborhood. So if you're looking at hotel and your occupancy percent change is +5 and your ADR percent change is +10, then the RevPAR percent change will be close to +15. You can add them up. Now, it's not going to be exact. It could be +14.5 or 15.3, but it's not going to be 17. It's not going to be 12. It's going to be in the same neighborhood. And then finally, when analyzing percent changes, and that's part of what we'll be doing in the upcoming training, lots of things to take into consideration when you're looking at percent changes. Economic conditions. There are times where percent changes are going to be negative. It's obvious. If we're in a downturn, everybody knows percent changes are going to be negative. Calendar holiday. If Easter falls in one month one year and a different month another year, you can expect the percent changes to be negative. Special events. If you had a big conference this year, you know your percent change is going to be high. Your occupancy and ADR are going to be higher this year. But if that big event was last year in this month, then you know this month will be low. It'll be negative compared. So lots of different scenarios and analyzing percent changes is important, and we'll look at that more in some of the samples that we're doing. Next up, date-related definitions and percent changes. Month is very simple. A definition of a month couldn't be simpler. It's simply the first day of the month through the last day of the month. Could be 31, could be 30, could be 28, could be 29. Now, the only exception is the case of February during a leap year. STR does treat that differently. So when there's 29 days in a February, we do something slightly different with that. Shoot me an email if you're really curious, but we have to treat that differently so that or data or performance gets distorted. Next up, daily data definitions. A couple obvious ones here. A week, first of all. A week always starts on a Sunday and it goes through a Saturday. But also, weekday. Weekday is defined as Sunday through Thursday. So Sunday is included in weekday. And then finally, weekend, that's Friday and Saturday. That's the weekend. Now, certain reports at STR and certain user interfaces allow you to define the weekend because obviously in the Middle East, there are countries where a weekend is considered to be Thursday and Friday instead of Friday and Saturday. We do allow for that. So monthly percent changes, what do? They compare the month this year to the same month last year. For example, if I'm looking at May of 2020 or May of 2021, I'm comparing it to May of 2020. So it's the same month 1 year prior. Important to understand it's a year-over-year situation. Daily percent changes. They compare the day this year to the comparable day last year. Now, it is not the exact same date. It's going to be off a little bit. We always compare a Wednesday to the closest Wednesday last year. And as I said, it'll be off a date or two, depending upon whether you have a leap year in there. So Tuesday, May 15th of 2018 would get compared to Tuesday, May 16 of 2017. So comparable day, not date to date. A couple multiple time periods to make sure you understand. And we'll be looking at this data as we start looking at reports. When it comes to monthly data, we have 3 multiple time periods. First, year to date. Very easy. That's simply January through whatever month you're in. If I'm in May, it'd be the data January through May. Running 3 month, that would be the current month. If I'm in May, that would be May plus the prior 2. So that would add in March and April and May, a 3-month running average. And then running 12 month, that would be the current month plus the prior 11. So if it's May, then that would be the prior 11. So it would actually be June of the prior year running 12 month up to May of the current year. Some people will call that a 12-month moving average. It means the very same thing. When you're talking about daily data, there are multiple time periods here. Current week would be the 7 days, as we said before, starting on Sunday, ending on Saturday. Month to date. Now, that's a valid time period as well, which we'll see in some reports. That would be the first of the month through whatever the current day is. And then one more, running 28. That would be the current day plus the prior 27. And that sometimes gets referred to as a running 4-week or running 28-day, means the same thing. Now, when it comes to these multiple time periods, an important methodology for you to understand, the metrics for any multiple time periods like the ones we just covered, they're valuable for analyzing performance. You're going to see them in reports, but the critical thing to emphasize is that they are based upon aggregated raw data. It is not a straight average. So there are 2 steps. First step, we aggregate the raw data, and that means the supply, the demand, and the revenue. Step 1, we aggregate data. Step 2, we apply the occupancy, ADR, RevPAR, the KPI formulas to the aggregated data. Let's walk through this and see exactly how this works, because this is tricky and a lot of people don't get this. This is actually the most common customer service question we get at STR. So here's how we do it. Let's say you need to determine a May year-to-date occupancy. Okay, now we do that for you, but if you're checking it, here's how it's done. May year-to-date occupancy, and here's your data for your hotel. You have the raw data, supply, demand, and revenue in column B, C, and D. And then in column A, you see the months, the 5 months that make up May for a May year-to-date number. So what do? Step 1, we aggregate the data. Now in Excel, we can do that with a sum function, and you see that in row 7, sum of B2 through B6. And we sum up the supply, and that's displayed in row 8, 15,100. We use that same sum function to aggregate the demand, 11,578, and we use the same sum function to aggregate the revenue, 1,096,121. So step 1, what do? We aggregate the data. Now, step 2, we have that aggregated data in row 7, May year-to-date, and now what do? We apply the KPI formulas. The KPI formulas are in row 8. The aggregated data is in row 7, and here's the formulas in row 8. C7 divided by B7, the demand divided by the supply times 100, and the answer to that formula is displayed directly above, 76.7. And then the ADR, D7, the room revenue, divided by C7, the demand revenue is $94.67. And then the RevPAR formula is in column G, D7 divided by B7, the answer displayed above, 72.59. The key is you aggregate the data first, and then you apply the KPI formulas. And I can't tell you how many times, you know, we're in a workshop and we ask people how to do that, and what do? Here's what they do for occupancy, for example. They'll calculate the January occupancy and they'll put that number in the table, and then they'll calculate the February occupancy, the March occupancy, the April occupancy, and the May occupancy. What will they do next? They'll add up the 5 occupancies and divide by 5. That would be a straight average approach. It's not going to give you the correct answer. Why? Because there are a different number of days in January versus February versus all the months involved. It's going to be close, but it will not be accurate. And as I said, that's the most common question when people call STR and say, hey, you know, there's something wrong in the data or on the report that I have. Good. Based upon aggregated data, that's key. One last set of definitions to mention to you when it comes to property level data. Another type of data we collect besides just the monthly data is a type of data called segmentation data. Now, the segmentation data is split into different buckets based upon the type of business. And let's look at the 3 types of business that we track. Group. Okay, now that means the rooms and the corresponding revenue. So we're collecting group rooms and group revenue separately from the total. But it's for business sold in blocks of 10 or more rooms. Now, so that could be a big group like a convention, or a big meeting, but it could also be a small group like a wedding or a family reunion. But group business, many hotels will submit that data separately. The next type of business is called contract. Now, contract really has two, there are two types of business that fall under contract. The first is airline crew. Airline crew business is defined as contract. And the second type is permanent guests. Some hotel have guests that are staying in the hotel, and that accounting dictionary that I mentioned to you earlier will have that defined. I think it's 90 rooms or 90 days or more is defined as a permanent guest. That business, again, the rooms and the corresponding revenue for airline crew and permanent guests would be defined as contract business. Now, everything else, all the other types of business in a hotel is defined as transient. That would be simply rooms sold at rack or corporate or package. Even government rates fall under transient. So that would be all the other travelers, the weekend getaways, the business people that are there just, calling on a customer, staying a night or two. All of that would fall under transient. That's those types of businesses. Those types of business, the room and revenue for that is called segmentation, and you'll see that's another type of data that we'll display in some of the reports coming up soon. Besides segmentation, one other type of data that's collected is additional revenue data. Now, this falls into two extra categories. Remember, we collect room revenue, that goes without saying, but many hotels submit additional revenue data, and it falls into two categories. First, food and beverage revenue. That is all the revenue a hotel earns from any food and beverage establishment. That could be banquet, that could be catering, that could be restaurant, bar, and room service would all fall in that big F&B category for revenue. The other category is simply called other revenue. Now, that's any other revenue source in the hotel. So it excludes room and it excludes F&B. So that could be revenue from a spa, revenue from a golf shop, retail, business center, any parking, any other type of revenue that the hotel earns. So two other types of additional revenue. Look at the question too. Many hotels submit segmentation data and additional revenue data. It's especially popular with the higher end hotels, luxury and upper upscale properties. The majority of them submit this type of data. You can see the value behind it, and I'll show you samples of this when we start looking, when we get into section 3. What happens when they submit this data? Hotels that submit this data will obtain additional pages in their STAR reports that will help them analyze these metrics and comparing their performance to their competitors. So that's it for property data. As I said, this is subsection 1 in the hotel math section. There are quiz questions in here that we want you to go through, make sure you understand these. Oh, this is important to point out. Notice in this particular quiz, there is a table displayed with sample data at the top, question 35. And the question is going to ask you to calculate a KPI, calculate a formula. Here's March year-to-date occupancy. Now, what would you have to do for that? For March, you'd have to go in there and remember the occupancy formula, which is the demand divided by supply, 3255 divided by 4650 times 100. That's going to give you an occupancy of 63.2. The quiz questions like this, you will see very similar questions on the exam. So like I said, we do want you to remember these formulas and be able to calculate the math. You can have your phone. You can use the calculator on your phone during the exam. Question 36 asks you to calculate a percent change. Remember, this year minus last year divided by last year. So use the quiz questions to check these. Be sure that you can actually do the math. And that is it for the property level data, subsection 1 in the hotel math